My wife, I can take a watch, put it on my wrist, and within 5 minutes it has stopped. I can take it off, hand it to my wife. She doesn't do anything else. She puts it on her wrist, it keeps perfect time. Take it off, put it on my wrist, it will stop.
You're magnetic.
Yes, magnetic, electromagnetic.
I thought it was charming.
Before we get started, we should update on Project One grading.
Oh, go ahead.
So we have Project One grading. I don't know if Canvas alerts you when we mute an assignment so that everyone gets their grades back at the same time. So we have that underway. It is taking a little while. We had said Friday, but then obviously we want to get the Project 2 proposals also. But it is going to be this week. So Wednesday, we said it was a stretch goal. So for today, but it is underway. So yes, that's the announcement.
I want to talk about what my business is called the rationalist paradox, and I've kind of added the ethical paradox to this. Don't be the ugly American. So I'm going to tell you an anecdote that runs through the lecture. How many people here are fluent in Spanish? Okay, a couple of you. I'll tell you the other part of this anecdote because it's embarrassing to me. You'll enjoy it. My wife and I were in northern Spain. It was late at night. We were having a thing for once, because it was cold and wet and we were tired, we ate in a hotel, the hotel we were staying in, the hostel. And we were the only people in the place who could speak Spanish. They're all American, older American and British tourists. And my Spanish is más o menos, but when I'm in Spain or Costa Rica, it comes back. Not always perfectly, as you will hear. And the man at the table next to me, older American, was trying to charge his meal to his room. And the waitress didn't speak English. And so he finally figured out she was asking him what number. And he says, unos, dos, 8. He looks at him. He looked at her, and so he said it. Unos, dos, 8. You know, slower, louder. You yell it slow enough and loud enough, you know, they'll get it. Finally, I kind of leaned over and looked at the waitress and said, you know, siempre ocho. Okay, she wrote it. And this lecture is, don't be the ugly American. Don't just keep yelling unos, dos, 8. This is a metaphor for why facts don't work in arguments about sustainability. The rest of this story is the same night. My wife is this is the embarrassing part. And if you speak Spanish, you'll get it. My wife was sick to her stomach, and I only ordered her a bowl of soup, and she had about 2 bites, and the waitress came up and says, ¿Es un problema tu no gusto? You don't like the soup? Is there a problem? And my wife is embarrassed to make a fool of herself, so she lets me do all the speaking in foreign countries. So I said, no problema, ella no tiene hombre. No, ella no tiene hombre. I got it right there. In Spanish, like French, you say she has no hunger. The word for hunger is hombre, right?
Hambre.
Hombre. So what I said is, ella no tiene hombre. And she doesn't have a name. The waitress looked at her. She was good. She looked at her. She looked at me. She looked at my wife, patted her on the hand, and said, "Pobrecita, comprendo, pobrecita." Okay.
Very funny.
You know, you didn't even need to translate that. That was good.
Yeah, I make a fool of myself in many languages. Okay. That's probably the funniest this lecture is going to get. That's certainly the funniest this lecture is going to get. So I asked you to read this essay by Judith Shulevitz from the New Republic from a year and a half or so ago. And when she asks this question, you know, why do people persist in underestimating risk in the face of clear scientific consensus? She asks a question that all of us who do sustainability, oops, wrong button, face. Why do people persist in underestimating risk in the face of clear scientific consensus? Really? That's pretty clear. So in that essay, she articulates what people in my business and environmental communication call the rationalist paradox. That is, even when people know the facts about an environmental issue or an issue in sustainability that demands action or change, they continue to act as if they didn't know it. The facts seem to go right past them, even when they can repeat them to you, sort of like my 11-year-old often. So Shulevitz writes, clearly scientists can't manage public relations to risk as well as they'd like. History has made fools of I wish you wouldn't say that, but the point. History has made fools of environmentalists who believe that people would change their behavior if only they knew how bad global warming would be.
Yeah.
For those of you who remember Philosophy 101, Plato, the Greek philosopher who I hate because he hated rhetoricians, had what he called the Socratic paradox, which is why I call it the rationalist paradox. Plato said, being an idealist, that knowledge was sufficient to appropriate action, end quote. If you knew what the right thing to do was, you would automatically do it.
What?
Thank you.
Has he heard of Adam and Eve?
He was Greek, so no, he hasn't. And in fact, I'm going to talk at the end of this about what I call the ethical paradox. And so, yeah, you know, how many times has your minister said, really? You did that? You know better. You know that. Or I'm not going to look at Melissa. Carl, you know better.
I hear that once a day.
You're lucky. Okay, so when Shulevitz then, so this is what I want to talk about tonight. How do you understand it? What do you do about it? This is a central kind of communication problem we have. So when Shulevitz speculates about this seemingly irrational behavior, 1/3 of Americans, now it's up to about 45 or 50% of Americans don't believe in anthropogenic climate change. She articulates a number of possible explanations why. Do the skeptics, roughly 1/3, it's more than that, act in bad faith? Do they just think badly? Are they cynical, ill-educated, innumerate, distrustful of science, pawns of the merchants of doubt? Each one of these explanations carries some weight, but I want to try to unpack this, because this, for those of us who talk about sustainability, this is a consistent problem. To say that people are ill-educated and innumerate, that they're English majors and they can't add. If there are any other English majors in the room, I'm sorry, but most of my undergraduates say, I'm in English because I can't do numbers. Suggests what's called the deficit model of science and science communication. That is, if they don't know or understand the scientific facts according to this model, we should inform them, preferably in nicely accommodated ways that you've learned how to do. And that line of thinking leads you to action based on the assumption that if people had all the facts and understood them, they'd act accordingly. Knowledge is sufficient to appropriate action. But that's not really how the world works. There's a lot of evidence that that's not always the case. And if you base, as so many people do, your communication strategy that if someone doesn't agree with you or isn't doing what you want, you just give them more facts, you're going to be unsuccessful and frustrated most of the time. Alternatively, people talk about being pawns of the merchants of doubt. Okay, that's not nice. Oh, okay, wait a minute. New clicker. I should point it at the computer, not at the... There you go. Pawns of the merchants. You know, there's a new book out on the history of climate change called Merchants of Doubt. It's a very nice, interesting book. You know, this theory recognizes that think tanks like the Cato Institute and ExxonMobil, who spend millions of dollars producing public information or public misinformation campaigns, have convinced the public that anthropogenic climate change doesn't exist. They're doing it, of course, because they sell fossil fuels. You know, there's a book out by the Union of Concerned Scientists called Smoke, Mirrors, and Hot Air that details this pretty nicely. In my field, in communication studies, Marlia Banning, a colleague of mine, has published a really wonderful article in what we in rhetoric call manufactured controversies. That is, it's not really a controversy, it's controversy that's been manufactured by these merchants of doubt. That is, it creates a public sense of doubt and disagreement where none really exists. That happens, that's really powerful. I think providing information in the form of public information campaigns, you know, newsletters, infographics, you know, the kinds of things you're learning to do are useful. What we say and how we say it matters, but that's frequently not enough to deal with the rationalist paradox. A more intractable form of this comes from what the Shulevitz article refers to as cultural cognition, Dan Kahane's work. That is, the theory of cultural cognition is, if I wanted to be technical, it's really preliminary step to the rationalist paradox. It's not you know the facts and don't act accordingly, but your cultural positioning, your beliefs, your values, your ideology, your worldview, give it what name you like, prevents you from not just accepting, but perceiving the facts. The way you perceive the world is determined by what you think, believe, and value. So that Kahane and his colleagues asked this question, it's a slightly different version. How do people, particularly ordinary citizens, who lack not only experience with myriad hazards, but also the time and expertise necessary to make sense of complex technical data, how do they form positions on the dangers they face and what they should do about them? He and his colleagues, people who do cultural cognition, argue that people accept or reject information about risk based on the pre-existing cultural values they bring to it. So here's the article you read has a version of this. Here's the original diagram of this. It's a diagram, came out in 1990 here, and roughly, you don't need to know the details of this, but roughly it says, if you look at people and you say, some people value, radical individuality, individual action, freedom and autonomy. Some people tend to be more communitarian. Hey, I've got a pointer. Tend to be more communitarian, believe in community, collective action. Some people tend to accept what Garrett Hardin from last week, I was talking about the tragedy of the commons, and Hardin says, in a democracy where things are held in common, we need to impose regulations on ourselves, what he called mutual coercion. Some people, like me, believe in those things. Think, oh yeah, we can't all drive as fast as we want on the highway because that's dangerous. We should all obey the speed limit, which I sort of do. And some people are, no, there should be no restrictions on my behavior. The less government, the better. Government regulation is a bad thing. And you can, in this theory, I don't care really about the details. I'm trying to get you to get the concept. They say, okay, some people, the hierarchist, they believe in the collective good, but they also believe that that collective good can be found by imposing restrictions, law, regulation, as opposed to the radical individualist who thinks that, individual activity and money is the bottom line, and you should have the free hand of the market and the least regulations you can possibly get. In a more recent book by Mike Hume called, let me make sure I get the title right, Why We Disagree About Climate Change, Understanding Inaction, Controversy, and Opportunity. There you go. Hume takes this, he modifies this chart, and a piece of this chart here says, how do you think about nature? If you're an egalitarian, you think nature is ephemeral, it changes a lot, it's quixotic, and you better be very careful and tread lightly on the earth. If you're a fatalist, nature is capricious. Stuff, can't say that word, stuff happens, you can't predict it, so it doesn't matter what you do, you might as well drive the big carbon footprint because we're all going to die in the deluge anyway, what the heck, carpe diem. If there were a world enough in time, madam, this Hummer would be no crime. Andrew Marvell's Carpe Diem poem to my coy mistress. If there were a world enough in time, this coyness, madam, would be no crime, and then he tries to seduce her. Okay, sorry, English professor poking through. Okay, there was a moment of levity in the lecture. Yeah. So what Hume does is he takes this and he says, if you live down here in this corner, if you're an individualist who hates restrictions, your values are going to lead you to reject the notion of anthropogenic climate change. Not because you can't see the facts, that because you're smart, and this is really accurate, you're smart enough to know that if you accept it and say it's true, the only thing you could possibly do is have the EPA and the federal government bring in a whole lot more regulations to curtail what you can do. You don't get to drive the Hummer. You don't get to keep your house at 90 degrees in the winter in the upper, in Minnesota. There are things that your freedoms will be curtailed because we can't do it. The argument is not about facts, right? That is the point that Kahane, the cultural cognition people, Hume are making is often the debate is not about facts because you filter those facts that you will or will not accept through a pre-existing identity, cultural position, view, way of seeing the world. And those facts just don't work. And this is my don't be an ugly American. If that's what the argument is about, if that's what the disconnect is about, yelling more facts at them is just going to piss them off. It's not going to get you anywhere. It's counterproductive. Unos, dos, eight. Try it again. This was what I was talking about the other day.
Oh, I have a question then.
Yes.
I wasn't sure if you were moving on from that graph. So do we think that 50% of the people fall into that category, that they just can't believe it? If that's what or do we think that some of them are being lost to the other categories that we need to try different outreach tactics to reach them?
I think, I'm somebody stop me here. I'm freelancing.
Okay.
There are lots of surveys done. The Yale Climate Change Project, the George Mason University Climate Change Project do annual surveys of American opinion. And I do read those and take a look at them. I'm going to be X number of percentage points off. There's going to be, what is it when you call a survey? The margin of error here, is, 5 to 10 points. But yes, think about it. In America today, there are a great number of people. There is a large political movement that wants to restrict the size and the scope of government. Don't tread on me. That government which governs least governs best. Thomas Jefferson. That worked in the 17th, maybe even in the 18th century. A little different, the world has changed. A little different in the 21st century. A lot more people, a lot more problems, a lot more complexity. But yes, a great deal of people in America fit down here. We are the country that believes in, radical individual rights. For most of my life, the cultural icon has been the Marlboro Man. You ride off into the sunset on your horse and smoke your cigarettes, and if anybody gets in the way, you're packing. So I'm being a little facetious, but if you have this position, there were arguments that we ought to have mass transit here in Tampa St. Pete, light rail, and not a fair number, but some of the vocal opposition said that was socialism. That was government taking your car away and making you ride the train. That's socialism, and it was reviled as a socialist collectivist thing. That's a fairly extreme position, of course. But yes, I think a fair number or a fair percentage, margin of error, of the people who say climate change doesn't exist, anthropogenic climate change doesn't exist, or I don't want to do this about sustainability because that's not really a problem. The bumper sticker you saw the other day on the back of the car coming to school, there was smoke coming out your ears that said, "My carbon footprint's bigger than yours." Right? No, this was you telling me in the office.
It was me? Okay.
Yes, that you were riding your bike to work and somebody in this great big thing drove past you with a bumper sticker that said, it's like, my child is smarter than yours,
Yeah.
and my child's honor was my carbon footprint's bigger than
I
yours.
get angry about too many things. I can't remember. Apparently, yes.
You've been
I
hanging out
believe
with
you.
me.
Yes. I believe you.
There is a fair amount of that reaction, for what psychology would call reaction formation. So I will get to this later in the lecture. Partly it's where you come from, partly your worldview, partly it's also your identity. You're a member of a community, and it's like being a member of a very religious Orthodox community and deciding to espouse some social position that most of the people in your community think of as anathema or as sinful. And you're not going to do that because you lose who you are, you're excommunicated, your identity and your social group disappears. There's a lot of that at stake. what I'm trying to get at is unpack all the reasons, I teach a whole course in this in English, all the reasons why people might say anthropogenic climate change doesn't, exist, or we don't want to do this sustainability thing. That's not about facts. Yes?
Yeah, and also if it supports your livelihood.
Sure, then there's the economic one, that behavior supports your life. I mean, that's truer for like the big oil companies. I'm
But
trying,
if you work for like ExxonMobil,
sure,
whatever level, I think that's still gonna.
yeah. I'm trying to think of something closer to home that's not about climate change. But certainly anything, bottom line, anything that's going to, I hate the word impact, anything that's going to be detrimental to your own individual economic well-being, you're going to resist. I, on the other hand, know I should drink less beer because it's not good for me. At least I know that, but I continue to act as, and I will at 9:30 tonight, or 10 o'clock tonight when I get home, I will act as if I didn't know that, because it's pleasant, it's enjoyable, which is part of this lecture. I'm not just being facetious. So where was I?
So if facts don't work and everything is all about world perception, it makes it, I should be pessimistic about convincing people why there is climate change, or I mean that's how I feel.
I'm going to get, I will answer your question and then I'm going to get off topic. Guess what? Yet again. I don't know if you should be pessimistic or fatalistic about it. What you shouldn't think is, if I gather enough facts and I write it clearly enough and present it beautifully, that'll do the trick.
Yeah, you want.
There is a field started in about the 1980s in America called Public Understanding of Science. The acronym is PUS. Yeah, and it was founded to increase science education with the theory that if we just teach everybody enough science, they come to understand science the way we do as scientists, this will solve the problem. They've been trying that for 30 years and it hasn't worked. This is in some senses, this lecture says that whole field is largely mistaken. It's not a bad idea, and it will help some, but that's, this is more, the resistance, the problem is more complicated than that. It's not just, listen, sit down, shut up, listen to me, my brain to your brain.
Sure.
When you know what I know, you'll agree with me. Not gonna work. Partly what this lecture is about, when we get to the later part of it, is there are some things you can do about it. They're not going to work all the time. They're not going to work for every person. But there are things you can do about it. And you can present facts clearly and nicely. And that'll work some of the time. I'm not totally pessimistic. What I'm trying to get us to think about is we need to get out of the paradigm, the deficit model. Look, you just don't know enough. That hasn't worked. And there are a lot of reasons. Kahne's is one reason why, the explanation for why it hasn't and won't work completely. It'll work a little bit. This communication problem is like dealing with climate change, what the climate scientists say. You've heard the metaphor, there's no silver bullet. There's a shotgun shell full of silver pellets. There's no silver bullet. You can't just teach them the facts and you're done. There are lots of strategies, and I want to talk about those. My point here, and I've talked about Bourdieu, this is a different version of it. Instead of, I'll believe it when I see it, I'll see it when I believe it. When I have a set of beliefs that allow me to accept that perception of the world, then I will. When I come from the kind of place in the universe where anthropogenic climate change is not threatening to my beliefs, to my values, or who I am as a social being, what group I'm a member of, then I'll accept it. That's what's at stake often in changing people's minds. Okay, so I have to quote a rhetorician. Walter Fisher points out to us that, he says, humans are rhetorical beings who are persuaded by things, are as much valuing beings as they are reasoning. It's as much about what you value as it is about what you know. Or as one of my colleagues with whom I've written says, we're not minds stuck in bodies. We're bodies that have minds in them. We're not Mr. Spock, a mind stuck in a body, but the body is irrelevant. It's purely rational. We are bodies that have minds in them, and you have to think about that embodied sense of subjectivity that you're addressing, not pure rationality. Let's see, where was I? Am I? So, what Kahane suggests, and he's not wrong, he says, okay, instead of shouting facts at people, what you need is a genuinely pluralistic environment where you have free and open public deliberation in which the values of all sides get to be presented equally. And you talk about this. This is one strategy. It's very labor intensive. It's very messy. You have to have the ability, which I'm not really good at. In my business, it's called rhetorical listening. You have to be willing to listen to these people honestly, who you think are so wrong in every possible way, but they think you're so wrong in every possible way. It's hard to do it slow. It's a strategy. The problem with this strategy, in a book called The Theory of Communicative Action, famous German philosopher Jürgen Habermas writes about the big famous concept, what he calls the ideal speech situation, in what he calls communicative ethics. If you want to communicate with people and be ethical in it, you have to try to approximate the ideal here, in which everybody gets an equal place, everybody gets their say, everybody gets listened to, everybody has equal access to the floor and to speak. And even Habermas recognized that as a normative ideal, but not terribly realistic. The feminist philosopher Nancy Fraser has critiqued this correctly and said, well, that sounds really good, but for a couple of thousand years, women have been mostly marginalized in those public debates, and women don't really have a place at the table, and they don't have the kind of cultural power to be heard. So, nice idea, Jürgen, but you're going to have to change all of culture first. So, this is a strategy, and it's a good idea. It's more an ideal than a practical working solution to it. Where am I? Okay. So, my next strategy. Anybody here ever hear of framing or frame theory? You ever heard of George Lakoff's book, Don't Think Like an Elephant? George Lakoff is a famous linguist. His most famous book is called Metaphors We Live By. But back in the Clinton administration, I guess it was, Lakoff wrote this book that said, look, the reason the Democrats continue to get their clock cleaned in elections is they don't know how to frame, present they don't know how to package intellectually and culturally their political positions. And one of the ways you can respond to this rationalist paradox is through frame theory. One of the granddaddies of American frame theory is Rob Benford here in our sociology department. He's a friend of mine. And Rob, I want to talk a little bit about frame theory, because this is, I saw you said, what do I do? Do I just give up? Here's another strategy. One is lots of talk and deliberation, and you try to be willing to listen and patient. Kind of like when my 11-year-old is having a bad day and I have to practice being a good daddy. At the end of the day, it's because I said so. Frame theory. I want to talk about this a little bit, because this is a really useful way of getting around, perhaps, some of the problems in the rationalist paradox. So what is it? According to frame theory, frames, the originator of it, Irving Goffman, in a book called Frames, says, each one of us employs schemata, strategies, schemes of interpretation which enable us to locate, perceive, identify, label things that happen within our life. These interpretive frames help us to render events and occurrences meaningful and thereby function to organize our experience and guide our actions. That is, the frames we bring to interpret the world tell us what's meaningful and in what way it's meaningful. So you could frame education, as so many people do, as vocational training, in which case you'd see the university as one kind of thing. You'd think about tuition, you'd think about return on investment, you'd think about amortizing your investment, you'd think about all the economics of it. This is how the state of Florida thinks of universities. You may or may not know that all the universities, we have what we, I just backed up. There are 10 criteria on which budgets are given to state of Florida universities. If you score high on those 10 criteria, you get your budget. If you score low on it, they take your money away. Every one of those budgets has to do with, do your people get jobs? What's their starting income? How fast do they get out of school? If you could, what percentage of your undergraduates graduate from college with the minimum number of student credit hours required to get a degree? If they graduate with more credit hours, you get punished. Because of course, they're spending more time in the university, sucking down more tax money than they absolutely have to. So this does things like, if you're a double major, don't do that. Go get your major in engineering. You want to get a double major in engineering and English, that takes more student credit hours, you shouldn't do this. Get that one major and graduate. If you want another major, come back to school and get another one. And it frames education as a cost-benefit economic issue. You could, as some people do, frame education as, this is about training people who are going to go out there and be citizens in a democracy. And they need to be able to think about, they need to understand this, science, humanities, philosophy, art, to be good, productive citizens in a democracy where we think about sustainability, for example. You can frame education as democracy as opposed to economic profit. And what you see, what's meaningful at the university, is going to shift depending on how you frame it. Does that? Examples help. So framing, they say, I'm going to be a little quicker, is a process. It changes. It's how we make sense of events. It's how we, I hate, dangerous terms, it's how we socially construct our reality. I regularly have undergraduates say that paying $6,000 tuition for the university is a ripoff, and that by the time they're done, they'll have paid $25,000 tuition and fees to get a university education. And I ask them, what kind of car do you drive? And usually the car costs more than their college education. Often, well, it depends on the university, but often the car costs as much or more than the education. And if they frame this as just about money, that's, I would try as an educator to frame it otherwise, to get them to change the point of view from which they look at it, and then the process of the university becomes different to them. They interpret those events, and they're meaningful in different ways. At the end of this, my friend Rob Benford is a social activist, and he does social movement theory, and he's working on climate change social movements. At the end of the day, what he calls collective action frames, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit. What does he say? They perform the interpretive functions by simplifying and condensing complicated aspects of the world out there, but in ways that are intended to mobilize potential movement adherents, people, to be constituents of your movement, to garner bystander support, to demobilize opponents. If you're a sustainability professional, you're trying to get people to come on board to a sustainability campaign, this is what you're trying to do. Collective action frames are action-oriented sense of beliefs and meanings. They inspire people, they legitimate particular activities, like riding your bike, walking to work, recycling, and they inspire campaigns and social movement organizations. So, according to Rob Benford and his co-author, framing is always about negotiating meaning. So one of the ways you deal with the climate denialist is you reframe climate change. You try to reframe it, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that. Oh, what the heck. I will cut to my very last slide. Oh, this one. Has anybody here ever heard of creation care? Okay. Creation care is a kind of broad movement by, I'm not sure I can say this, the radical wing of the evangelical Christian movement in America. It was founded by Dick Seismic. I've heard the guy talk a number of times and I've met him. He's a remarkable man. And the creation care says, let's frame climate change as a religious duty. These, and I hope you hear me being absolutely sincere. These are really devout Christians. Seismic, he was telling me, he said, when I was 12, I had my Paul on the road to Damascus conversion moment when God spoke to me and I came to Christ. He said, and about 5 years ago, I had a second conversion moment. I was at a climate change conference at Oxford that I went to thinking, okay, I might as well hear what these, what these people say. I don't believe a word of it, but he said, I sat there, he said, and it was the same thing. It was a revelation and an epiphany, and I realized that as a Christian, my duty that God gave me was to be a good steward of this earth, to take care of his creation. I hope you don't hear anything but sincerity. And a group of like a couple hundred of these evangelicals wrote this beautiful letter. I've republished it in a book, the Evangelical Call to Action. Over the last several years, many of us have engaged in study, reflection, and prayer related to the issue of climate change, often called global warming. For most of us, until recently, this has not been treated as a pressing issue or a major priority. Indeed, many of us have required considerable convincing before becoming persuaded that climate change is a real problem and that it ought to matter to us as Christians. But now we have seen and heard enough to offer the following moral argument related to the matter of human-induced climate change. We commend the four simple but urgent claims offered in this document to all who will listen, beginning with our brothers and sisters in the Christian community, and urge all to take the appropriate actions that follow from them. And the whole thing, it's a beautiful piece of writing. These guys give sermons for a living. They know how to talk. It's a beautiful piece of writing. But what they have done in terms of framing is they've said, look, we're not going to give you facts. We're not going to talk about economics. We're not going to talk about right or left-wing politics. We're going to look at you and talk to you as Christians and say, this is a religious issue. You have a religious, if you're a Christian, you have a religious duty to take care of this planet that your Lord Jesus Christ gave you. And if you don't, you're disobeying one of your fundamental commandments. And they reframe the issue. And people who are on the political ultra-right in many, many ways, and who would be distrustful of government because it's going to force your insurance company to do, birth control and contraception, and it's going to do X, Y, and Z, all of a sudden are ardent climate change activists because the issue has been reframed, not as one of government, secular government telling you what to do, but one of your individual Christian duty to your Creator. Does this work? This is an example. Yes?
So, essentially framing is just identifying the values of your audience and then presenting it within the context of their values.
In a very real way, I'm trying to get back to where I was. Yes, in a very real way, what it does is it says, if, and this is why when I was talking about Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, I said, I disagree. I don't think you change everything all at once. I think, in fact, you appeal to people's existing values, and you try to take the topic and interpret it. Give them a way of interpreting sustainability, climate change,